Eckhart Tolle, who wrote The Power of Now, was in his backyard living in like a little shack. Steve gave me that book and I gave it to Oprah, and he sold, 40 million copies.
Oh, I think that mostly mindful meditation is a fad.
And then you go on to say, and I quote, that humanity is now faced with the stark choice, evolve or die.
But I have never picked a book that I believe had greater importance for our time. Get ready to be awakened.
So it was a perfect product to market called enlightenment. Like, this is the price you pay.
Mr. Eckhart Tolle, who has written a wonderful book called The Power of Now, A Guide to Spiritual Enlightenment.
It kind of goes back to my early 20s. I'll just briefly tell you a psychological transformation that I went through at that time, virtually an overnight transformation. I had just been awarded a scholarship, research scholarship for Cambridge University, so I've been doing quite well on an external level. Everybody considered that my life was successful, but inside I was suffering from very deep depressions and continuous states of anxiety, and I had been suffering from that for years. So I was actually miserably unhappy, while everybody else around me thought that I was a very successful person. So there was one night when I reached a kind of the depths of a depression, and a thought kept reoccurring in my mind that I can't live with myself any longer. The pain of this dreadful unhappiness is too much. I can't take it anymore. I can't live with myself any longer. And that sentence became a trigger for a transformation. I cannot live with myself any longer. And suddenly I thought, what does this mean? Who is the I and who is the self that I cannot live with? There was a kind of separation that occurred at that moment. I separated myself, my sense of identity separated from the unhappy, depressed and anxious person, and suddenly there was me here observing that unhappy self. So there was a disidentification, and I thought, how is that possible? I can now observe the unhappiness as if it were in me, but not essentially me. So that was, I described that in a little bit more detail in the book. When I woke up the next morning, I was in a state of very deep peace, and that lasted for several months, and it never really left me, but that deeply blissful state lasted for several months, and I didn't know what had happened to me. How is it possible that from one day being a very anxious person, I could suddenly become transformed into a deeply peaceful person? And it was only years later that I understood what actually had happened to me at that time.
What was it?
The suffering me is ultimately a fiction of the mind. I had created a mental fiction that I believed in and identified with. You could call it the ego. And through the pressure of suffering, I separated from that fiction. And when I separated from that fiction, it collapsed as if a plug had been pulled out of an inflatable toy, because it ultimately wasn't real. I realized then that the suffering self wasn't ultimately real. It was a fiction. And in a way, that's also the basis of the book. And when I later started to work with people, very often people came to me who were in some kind of suffering, some form of pain. And what I'm trying to convey and teach is that it is possible to live free of suffering, to go beyond suffering.
Well, what the expression that I'm really fond of is, instead of saying I am upset, because the I am is self,
Yes.
saying I'm having an upset.
Yes.
Or I am angry, I'm experiencing anger. To say I am upset or I am sick,
Yes.
is really sort of embedding that
That's
into
right.
yourself, where you say, I'm having an upset. Well, if you have something, you can give it away.
That's right. So it's already progress if from saying I am angry or I am upset, you say there is anger in me or there is upset in me. You have already separated your essential identity from the emotional state. So you are no longer reinforcing the emotional state through your identification. That's the beginning of inner transformation. It's that separation from the passing mental or emotional state.
The word enlightenment has been tossed about in so many different expressions, meanings, philosophies. Could you explain to us what is enlightenment?
The word enlightenment essentially comes from the East, originally from Buddhism. It points to a radical psychological transformation, but it's not confined to the East. It also exists in other ancient religions. The term salvation in Christianity, I believe, is really another form of the Buddhist enlightenment, or the term liberation in Hinduism is really just another way of pointing to the same thing. So they all point to the possibility of a radical inner transformation. All the ancient religions recognize that there is something wrong with human beings. Despite the ingenuity of the human mind, there seems to be some essential flaw which causes humans to go into suffering, to create suffering and pain for themselves and for others. And the ancient religions have given different names to that essential flaw. So Buddhism, for example, calls it, straightforward, calls it suffering. One of the characteristics of human existence, Buddhism says, is suffering. Hinduism says humans are in a state of delusion. There's the veil of Maya. We do not perceive things clearly. We see them as through a veil. So we are deluded. Christianity says there is an original state of sin that humans are in. So if you look at the deeper structure underlying all those terms, what it's really saying is there's something not right. Something seems to have gone wrong. But all the religions also say there is a path, there is a way of reversing this. So there's the bad news, which all religions agree on, and there's the good news, which also all religions agree on.
And do they agree in the process that it would take to create this so-called enlightenment? People live in a state of victimhood.
The process is the same. Sometimes the names and the terminology differs, but the essential process is the same. Really what it starts with is disidentify from the thinking mind. Now, this for some people may be a new thing, because most people are totally identified with their thought processes. So they are kind of trapped in their mind, and most people never, or almost never, experience a gap in the stream of mind. So the mind is like a river that pulls you along. It's almost as if somebody had built a noise machine into your head. It would be a fiendish thing to do. Imagine some demon builds a noise machine into your head and it doesn't have a switch off button. The first step is stand back inside yourself, take one step back and observe what the mind does. So you become the observer of your mind. And then you'll find that there are certain patterns that occur again and again, thought patterns, often negative ones. They're like old gramophone records that perhaps have been playing in your mind for years. So you take a step back and say, oh, so there's my mind, there I can observe the thoughts that go through my mind.